Period.
Listen to podcasts of Joe Walsh and Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
Good morning, Dan, and in for Amy this morning is Chicago Tribune columnist John Cass. And this week, to do a little rebranding, get his old mojo back as Bolshevik Bernie. So he gave a big 45-minute tour de force on central planning at George Washington University, in which he, among other things, had a bit of a festivus, the airing of grievances.
They are the profit-taking gatekeepers of our healthcare, our technology, our finance system, our food supply, and almost all of the other basic necessities of life. And let us name them. They are Wall Street, the insurance companies, the drug companies, the fossil fuel industry, the military-industrial complex, the prison-industrial complex, and giant agribusiness.
Well, he didn't say big tech in the second go-around when he sort of named them by group, but he mentioned it in the first go-around. And this is something with the socialists getting together to debate in a couple weeks, really. This is something that will be on the docket because you've had a number of Democrat socialist candidates, including the burgeoning Chief Warren, rising in the polls, who have called for the breakup of big tech companies. They want antitrust prosecutions of Facebook and Apple and Google and others. And this is something that's even being debated on the conservative side of the ledger because of course, of the leftist slant of these big tech companies and the censorship that that leftist slant has unleashed, such that that conservatives too see issues, now privacy issues as well as censorship issues, as the basis for an antitrust prosecution or some such regulation of these social media platforms as essentially public places of accommodation, the technical or the technological lunch counter.
Negatory on regulation.
Negatory on regulation, says John Cash.
Because regulation means I'm going to hire my senators and my congressmen to keep Dan Proft out of the business while they take a bigger chunk of the market share. But breaking up, I'm not that opposed.
Well, it's interesting, right?
But
because
regulation is like clearly what they've done, and to get themselves out of other pickles and
right, and invite the regulation to create barriers to entry,
exactly.
Which is why you're opposed to that. And but the idea of breaking them up, you're open-minded on. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Daniel McCarthy, who's a writer at The Spectator, director of the Robert Novak Fellowship Program at the Fund for American Studies, of which I am a graduate, and editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. Daniel has written a piece for at spectator.us for The Spectator that Facebook is the world's worst coffee house. Daniel, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, delighted to be here.
So give us the rationale for the setup of the comparison of Facebook to a coffee house, and a poor one at that.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to talk about the history of the kind of media environment and the retail environment that created the groundwork for freedom of the press back in the 18th century. And, in the 18th century and on through until quite recently, not only did you have a variety of publications competing with one another, a variety of magazines and newspapers and pamphlets, but you had a lot of different retail outlets, a lot of different places like libraries where publications were, also in a competitive environment in terms of who was providing them. And Facebook has kind of changed that. Now the social media networks have created a kind of intermediary layer between readers and publishers. And it's created another layer of kind of editorial supervision and intervention, which I think is kind of worrying to both sides of that situation. I think it's creating a situation where a lot of adults feel as if someone who has no business telling them what they can read or think is actually getting into the business of, saying you can't look at this website, you can't look at this YouTube video, you can't read this publication, you can't hear from this pundit.
Okay, but now that leads us to where in terms of policy making? Tyler Cohen, of course, he's a free market economist at George Mason University. Marginal Revolution is his blog. He writes, calling for the breakup of Facebook is not only unwarranted, it would be a misapplication of antitrust laws that would make current problems worse. And he mentions, in support of that contention, that unlike traditional villainous monopolists, Facebook has not raised prices. The service is free or restricted output. And people do not use Facebook because the company has emptied their lives of alternatives. We can still connect with one another by text, email, telephone calls, Pinterest, Twitter, LinkedIn, writing a blog, creating an online community, so on and so forth. There's also been op-eds from Facebook employees about the sort of the percentage of market share they control with respect to online ad revenue that speak to the lack of monopoly position. So we can criticize Facebook for how it's operating its business, but does that mean we should use antitrust laws to break it up?
It doesn't necessarily mean that. And in fact, not every problem in society has a policy or government solution.
Right.
When it comes to Facebook, I think one of the key things here is just to be aware of the amount of power this institution is starting to wield and the amount of editorial control that it has over, sort of expressions of individuals, but also the expressions perhaps of now, sort of more and more political publications.
Thank you.
And this is something I think can be countered in the first place by a bit of naming and shaming, a bit of sort of just publicizing what Facebook is doing. Breitbart, for example, has been publishing a number of articles focusing on the tech companies and their policies. The Daily Caller has been doing this as well. I think that's where things begin, is to at least call attention to the things that Facebook is doing that are amounting to censorship or amounting to political bias.
And this is an opportune time to do it when you have the left criticizing. It's actually sort of a teachable moment to say, well, we agree with some of what the left is saying with respect to concern about privacy rights, not living up to terms of use agreements and the like. But we don't think you should use the power of the state in this instance because it's not appropriate for these reasons. And this really distinguishes the whole sort of conservative versus command control mindset. So it's a real opportunity now to make these points that you're making through these outlets and others.
Yeah, you would think so, and you would think the tech companies would, see some enlightened self-interest here and would like to reform their own approach to doing business. On the other hand, there is this sense that there's so much kind of popular unhappiness with the tech companies, and the tech companies make a very convenient villain, such that even a lot of more populist conservatives are looking at them and saying, hey, you know what, let's just throw whatever at them we can get to stick, whether it's antitrust law, whether it's going after them on a regulatory level, but let's go after them just for the sake of kind of stirring up the animals and creating a bit of a political momentum for ourselves. So I think that it's a dangerous situation right now, where a lot of sort of half-baked policies are being thrown around just because people are feeling very charged up and polarized.
Well, there's nothing like having a group of faceless men sitting around a mahogany table dictating the end of the world or the controlling the world as we know it, and to hate on them. But what realistic things can be done? How about removing the protections that Facebook and others won for themselves when they said they weren't publishers, they were just, how does that work? I'm losing the thread of it now, but the early protections that they received from lawsuit have allowed them to strengthen their position. And how did that happen?
Yeah, because they are not considered the actual sort of publishers of their
Right.
content. They're not
Right.
they're not responsible for it. So if someone says something untrue or libelous on Facebook, the theory is, well, this is not Facebook saying it; it's just the individual saying it. And because Facebook, isn't taking responsibility for what these individuals are doing, because it's just a kind of, sort of open environment for them to say and do what they want to do, therefore, Facebook doesn't face any liability over that.
Right, but there is censoring going on, is it not?
That's right. Yeah.
Right?
So there's a bit of the privileges and the legal status that Facebook has is not quite doesn't quite match the actual practices that Facebook has adopted, or at least that's the way it looks to those of us who are laymen. Lawyers have been arguing about this and saying, well, the actual law here doesn't necessarily mean exactly what a lot of folks think it means. But in any case, there's clearly a bit of a misfit here, where Facebook wants to, on the one hand, claim that it really doesn't have editorial control over anything, but then on the other hand, it's using an increasingly restrictive and selective set of political criteria to decide what can be said upon its platform. And, it can't have it both ways. It has to decide one way or the other, whether it's a publisher or whether it's simply an open forum.
Well, that's right, and it's going to be interesting to see some of these civil cases. I would point most notably to Dennis Prager's suit against YouTube and parent company, of course, Google by extension, to essentially litigate this issue of whether or not these tech giants are publishers in effect when they have manipulated news feeds and the like. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out in civil courts in this country. Daniel McCarthy, author at The Spectator, director of the Robert Novak Fellowship Program at the Fund for American Studies, and editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. Check out his piece on Facebook at spectator.us. Daniel, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you. And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560 The Answer.